Okay, folks, we are live. So for those listening at home, welcome to the Live from the Sword Coast podcast. My name is Kevin Madison, and I will be your friendly dungeon user this evening. Tonight, I am going to be offering my thoughts on Mongoose Publishing's second edition Traveler Core Rulebook. This is the core rulebook for their second version, or their second attempt at publishing the Traveler role-playing game, a somewhat hard science fiction game featuring traveling tramp steamers and traders and merchants and so forth. This game, I'm going to launch into the proper review. Oh, I've got a co-reviewer of Amy Lou. Hi, sweetie. In a moment. But I wanted to share, I had a kind of a funny thing happen today that I wanted to quickly share with you. When I was in my friendly local gaming store today, and I was there picking up some gifts for a pair of friends. One of them had a birthday recently, and one of them I didn't need an excuse, so I wanted to get him a gaming book. So I was picking up some core books for Pathfinder, and these young kids were sort of talking about in front of the display. So I just said, "Oh, excuse me, guys," so I can get to the books. And one of the kids are about my son's age, so they're late teens, early 20s. And when the kids turns around and says, "Oh, so you're just getting into the game?" And they weren't staff there, because I know all the staff there. They were just friendly young gamers who wanted to try and help out an old guy get his bearings in a role-playing game. So I'm a very long time gamer. Oh, okay. The seeing the next year, I guess one of the concerns for quite some time there was that we were worried about whether this hobby was going to outlast us or not, because we're, self-centered and vain and whatnot, and clearly thought that, nothing would come after us. But also because the younger generation was, had more things to compete with for their times, like, the internet and video games and much more immersive and engaging sort of online play with video games. So the assumption is that sort of the tabletop gaming would go the way of the dinosaurs when we go. And it was really encouraging seeing not only some young kids who clearly, they're growing up with the hobby possibly, but they certainly were not around for second edition D&D. They at best maybe grew up with possibly, to be honest, it's probably not even third edition, given that Pathfinder is entering its 10th year now, or coming up on its 10th year. That's probably the Pathfinder, or maybe something like that, or 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons is probably their first version of it. So that's very cool that there's folks of that generation that are playing, but also people who are trying to be friendly and welcoming to other players. That's also very, very cool. So for anyone else who is of my generation, that I think that hopefully you'll find that story as heartening as what I did. So I was very pleased to see some friendly young gamers who hopefully will be playing for years and years and years, like what we ended up doing, or many of us ended up doing. So anyway, back to my review. That little bit of a war story or story from the gaming store aside, let's do what we're here to do, which is to talk about Traveler. Now, while I am a long-time gamer, Traveler is actually one of those games that I never really encountered in great detail or in a great deal. The only version of Traveler that I had previously owned and ran very, very briefly was the Traveler of the New Era game that was published by Game Designers Workshop in I believe the late 80s. I actually have a reprint of that. Oh, I should have got my handy things. This was the version that I first played, but this game's actually been around since 1977. Traveler was, to my understanding, the first science fiction role-playing game, in the same way that D&D was the first fantasy and that Call of Cthulhu was the first horror. Traveler was the trailblazer for that kind of role-playing game. And Traveler had, from my understanding, again, like I've never owned or played the earlier editions, but my understanding is that the way that you play Traveler has not really changed all that much. The setting is still the same, which is the Third Imperium, and what you do, which is just you kind of just go around and get in adventures and trade and try and pay off your ship and stuff like that. That's the default mode of play, and it has been for a very long time. I mentioned that Traveller is a science fiction game. It is a very particular type of science fiction game, at least the what's available in this book. So just as a cautionary sort of header before we launch into the review itself, Traveller is sort of billed as a go-to sort of science fiction role-playing game, but I'm not sure it is terribly translatable, or it's not something that that adapts extremely easily to a different style of play than what or a different setting than what is assumed. So what are we going to talk about right now? What we're going to do is I'm going to organize this review in the same way that I do all of my reviews, which is to say that I'm going to talk about first the background, which I think I've done already. So we're past that part. I'm going to talk about what the game's about. I'm going to talk about the core mechanic of the game, and this is actually a fairly simple one for this particular game. I'm going to talk about what you play, so who do you play in the game. I'm going to talk about what you do in the game. I'm going to talk about what's in the book. We'll go through what's the contents of the book, and then I'm going to talk about who this is for. So who I think the game might be directed towards, who might actually enjoy playing this game. Now, regular listeners of the channel might know that every second Wednesday we have been playing for the last couple of months a ongoing campaign, playing or starting to play the Pirates of Drinax mega campaign. Recently, it's not out in print yet. At least it's not here in print yet, even though I'm eagerly awaiting it. But in PDF, you can get a copy of the Pirates of Drinax campaign. And what this is a box set version of the campaign that had been previously upgraded, but a campaign that had been previously published for free through their website. That game is a hardcore sandbox where you are playing characters or travelers who are basically handed the keys to this awesome pirate ship by this wealthy king or minor emperor who has dreams of a grander empire, and you're sent out to go and do pirate crap and try and build a new empire. It's a very, very cool idea and setup for a campaign, and that's what we've been playing. So my experience with the game running it is really restricted to just those sessions. I've never run Traveller otherwise, certainly not as an adult. As a kid, I played or ran New Era quite a few times, but I never really ran games properly when I was a kid. So this is our first time. We have tried to abide by all of the rules in it and play the game as intended. And I've also got a very good friend at my friendly local gaming store who has been providing some really helpful advice because he's got an extensive amount of experience with Traveller. So he's helped me figure out some of the pitfalls and to get an idea of what the game, like the best intended way of running the game. So sorry, I'm having pop-ups come up that are driving me nuts. So that's my background with it. So I'm coming at this game very new. I can't really speak to how this has changed from the previous editions, other than to note that I do have a lot of source books for the previous edition of the Mongoose Traveller game, and those seem to transition seamlessly. Like I'm not noticing any significant rules differences, other than the way they set target numbers. Target numbers are a little different, but other than that, the professions from that I can use, the ship stats I don't think I can use, but I really haven't had to do that. So what is the game about? So as I said, the game is about you playing travelers. The way they describe the player characters in this, in the same way that D&D calls your characters adventurers, and the way that Call of Cthulhu calls characters investigators, this prompts you to think about what type of game you're going to be playing by calling your characters travelers. The characters who are not the stay-at-home types. They're out and they're doing exciting things in the galaxy. The setting for Traveller I mentioned was kind of a hard sci-fi. It has there is psionics, and psionics play or have a presence in the campaign setting. The default setting is a sort of a campaign setting or campaign setup called the Third Imperium, and the Third Imperium is basically the third kind of massive interstellar empire of humankind. And in the Third Imperium, there are different kinds of humans. There are two major sort of strains. There is Solomani, which is the people from Earth, and there are, oh gosh, I can't believe I can't remember it already. I don't remember, Viliani, I think was a second. Anyway, there's some other more advanced form of humankind. One of the conceits of the game is, or the setting, is that some ancient species came and kind of plucked humanity as well as some other species up from Earth and then reseeded them elsewhere. So there was an older empire, which was the First Imperium, which was effectively the this other ancient empire, and then humankind came in contact with them. I actually might be screwing this up. Maybe they're the second. Anyway, there's humankind at some point. Humankind from Earth at some point made contact with them, and then humans, as sort of is the case in most sort of action things, the plucky underdog humans with less technology and a less expansive empire or stellar presence actually defeated this much older and much more advanced civilization, largely because of decay. That's sort of one of the themes in the setting, is the idea that civilizations rise and fall, and technological levels ebb and flow, and whatnot. So the world that you're playing in Traveller has an extensive history behind it, which means that it has a really fun lived-in feel to it, where you can get a sense of every planet or every system that you go to. You have so there are older civilizations, or there was an older presence there, whether that's that it built up over time to become this very advanced civilization, or whether it peaked at a certain point and then went back, either because of some kind of domestic issue or issue on the planet, or whether there was some external factor, like a war, an interstellar war. So that's the let's see. So that the other two sort of things to talk about is, while psionics have a presence in the Third Imperium, they are illegal, and that's because there is, and I don't know whether they mention this in the core rulebook. The core rulebook doesn't give you an awful lot of setting information, but there is a ton of information online about this. This is an extremely storied game, so there's plenty of online resources to help you fill in the gaps. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of what the setting is about, so you can understand what you're doing in the game, because that's a lot of the conceits of the setting is what informs what you do with the game. One of the particular examples of that is the way that interstellar travel works. In this game, there's no such thing as faster than light communication. So what that means is that it's kind of like the Old West, where travel or news travels at the speed of the Pony Express. When someone from another town brings physically a message over, then that's when you get news. The Dark Ages may be a good comparator as well too, but I think there's more interstellar communication here than there is, or more communication between broader communities in this setting than there is in others. But one of the ways that matters is because news only travels at the speed of a ship. That means that you can't, if some threat comes out and attacks some other, place, or some attacks your community, you have to get a ship out to get help from somewhere else, and you can't rely on the fact that you're going to be able to get a message out and whatever. That's not a big deal in the more developed systems, but that's not really where they encourage you to play. The setting, that is included in the core rulebook, is a subsector called the Sindal subsector. The Sindal subsector, it has great history behind it. It was the seat of one of these massive interstellar empires that collapsed and was, like, 2,000 years ago or whatever, was bombed from orbit. You used artillery and biological weapons and whatnot and bombed it down to nothing. Or it was, there's other systems in that subsector where they were civilizations that were trying to throw off the yoke of this empire as it was collapsing, and the response of the empire was, as they say in New Hope, right? That's where the more he tightens his grip, the more systems will slip through their fingers. Well, they tighten their grip pretty hard on some of these systems. The other thing is that the game assumes that you're going to be, the way that interstellar travel will work is in a kind of hex crawl kind of way, where the maps that are provided have hexes that are the size of a sector. And I can't remember what the size, parsec or something like that. I don't remember offhand. But what it means is that basically I think it is a parsec, and then every your ships are rated in their jump rating, which is how fast they can basically travel through hyperspace or whatever it's called, to move from one system to another system. And the rating of your jump system tells you how many parsecs you can go. So, and then every time you jump out, you basically have to go and refuel, either by going to a station and getting it, or going to a gas giant and using a scoop and then processing the fuel, or purchasing it from some space station. That's what you have to do to, you can only jump so far. You generally don't carry more fuel than you need for one jump. And you spend a week of time on average in transit, regardless of what kind of how far your jump is going to go and what rating your jump system is. So what that means is, travel takes a long time. Messages only move at the speed of a ship, which means that getting a message from one sector to another sector is going to take a minimum, or parsec is going to take a minimum of 1 week, because that's even a one parsec jump is going to take you that long. Okay. Sorry, I'm using the dog at the same time. So what that means for your characters is that you're going to be constantly having to buy stuff. There's certain minutiae that you're going to have to constantly get, like buying fuel to be able to travel between the stars. The characters you're playing, the default is assuming that you're going to have a shared ship. Your ship is a shared resource, and with that comes a pretty heavy burden in the form of the mortgage to pay off. And the mortgage is, I had to check with my friend on this because I thought I was doing the math wrong. The mortgage is huge. Like it's an extraordinary amount of money that the characters have to be paying off every month in order to pay off their ship, to keep it flying. And there's expenses relating to repairs and whatnot. And so it's a bookkeeping heavy kind of game. But the way that the characters make the money to keep that thing flying is through a combination of undertaking tasks, like trying to find jobs, and buying and selling things. And I think the buying and selling and transporting passengers seems to be the core assumption, the core sort of activity that you're engaged in. There are some really interesting rules that we'll talk about when we go through the book about, finding vendors and buying stuff, seeing what's available, trying to negotiate and buy the stuff, and then trying to go somewhere else and sell the stuff to try and make some money. And the story that happens in the default way of playing seems to be a kind of emergent storytelling that you would see in other types of hex crawl games, because there's some terrific random tables that are included in the core rulebook and then in the supplemental material to give you an idea, some random elements that are introduced, like a escaping political prisoner is one of the passengers who's trying to get out on your ship. So you find yourself being pursued to the next system by someone else, or I don't know, any other kind of stuff. When one of the people on the ship has some kind of infectious disease or whatever. So it's it reminds me, to be honest, the most of the crew of the Serenity from Firefly. Less so from the film, because the film was more cinematic in scope. But if you think of things like or episodes of Firefly, like The Train Job or like Ariel, those feel, or even the pilot, I suppose, as well, the 2-hour pilot. That's what this game feels like. Characters living on their last credits on the edge of sort of the known universe. That's the default way of play. You trying to cut deals with people in certain systems to get a hold of some gear, and then find another system and go and sell it. And there's a very robust set of rules that your characters can interact with that support that kind of play. And by that I mean, there are factors like the tech level of the system you're in plays a role in whether you want to buy, whether it is more advantageous to buy or sell certain kinds of goods there. The starport that you happen to be in, likewise, the law level of the place you're at. Other different features of the setting. If you are trying to sell high-tech goods at a farming community, it's probably not going to be, you're not going to get a great deal for it. Whereas if you're trying to sell, say, chemicals that will be used in what do you call it, pesticides, that might be a really good thing. You might get some benefits on it. So it's hard to talk about what you do in the game without diving into some of those mechanics, because that's sort of why you're doing those things, you know. And it sounds really tedious and bookkeepy, but it's remarkably engaging in the way that in actual play, in the way that, you know, a strategy game like Masters of Orion, or I suppose Civilization or something like that, is really engaging, because the subsystems and the strategy that goes behind that stuff, and then also that stuff's really interesting. And then you add in the fact that this is a role-playing game, so there's other interesting role-playing stuff that comes up in that. So that's what the game is about, is you playing these travelers who are trying to sort of make their way in this universe. I mentioned that the Third Imperium is the setting. There are some other civilizations, like massive interstellar civilizations, in particular the Zodani, which are a strain of humanity that thoroughly embrace psionics, and their civilization is, it really takes advantage of that. So to the point where, you know, they will use psychic marines in their interstellar conflicts, where they will use the psionic ability, teleportation, to teleport a crew of marines into a zone of a rival ship, where they've already used other telekinesis, clairvoyance, to make sure no one's there, get there, recover from the jump, and then, you know, storm the ship and take it over. That's just one example of, and a fairly extreme example of the psionic use by the Zodani, but they're sort of one of the potential adversaries that you can use in your campaign. Another is the Aslan Hyrat. The Traveler setting does have aliens. It is it's not free of, you know, other alien species, and some of those alien species are either uplifted animals, like the ancients took a species of canines and transported them to another place, and they became the Vargur, which are these like jackal type people. You'll see some of them as we go through the core rulebook. But there are also other, like, degenerate, or maybe degenerate is not the right word, divergent strains of humanity as well. There's one particular strain of, or divergent strain of humanity, I believe, called the Florians, that you see in not the Sindel subsector, but in the called the oh gosh, I'm running a campaign as, and I'm drawing a blank for the name of it. That's not the Spinward Marches. Oh gosh. Anyway, it's the region surrounding the Sindel subsector. There's another one called the Florian League, and they actually are characterized, or they're ruled by two subspecies of humanity that are very, very different from humankind, as a result of, you know, genetic engineering from tens of thousands of years ago. And the final one I mentioned, the Aslan. The Aslan are these lion men that are located in sort of, they're across this giant rift of space. So their massive empire is sort of separated between, or separate from the Third Imperium. So they're not like right on each other's borders. But the Aslan will be a growing threat in the years to come. And in the Pirates of Drinax campaign, they have a huge presence, which is very, very cool. So that's the setting. And one thing, I guess one last thing I'll say about the setting in general is that it's cool that there's no good or bad characters in it. I'm going beyond the scope of what's in the core rulebook to explain this, but one of the things that I have found in reading and picking up some of the other materials is that the way that you choose to present some of these other alien species, it has a, you know, there's a great deal of flexibility in how you want them to feel. You know, so for instance, the Aslan, they give in the Pirates of Drinax book, and in the older version, the Spinward Marches, or not Spinward Marches, Trojan Reaches, that's what it's called, the Trojan Reaches. The Trojan Reaches book gives a bunch of different ways you can present the Aslan. So you can make them like old school Klingons, or you can make them like next generation Klingons, where, you know, they're like space Mongols, or they're space sort of, you know, Vikings, or space, you know, samurai. You can make them as savages, you can make them as whatever, and those, it doesn't change the underlying source material. It's just sort of the way that you present the things. They give similar options for the Vargur as well too. So it's a really it's an interesting universe, and there's a lot of flexibility that the DM has. Even though it's sort of a sandbox game, the way that the characters will interact with those other elements, you do have some agency over how you present that. So there is some creative output there as well. So that's what the game is about. What is the core mechanic? The core mechanic in the game is rolling 2d6. You roll 2d6, you add your skill and your attribute modifier. You have, and I actually don't think they call them attributes, I think they call them characteristics. And this, you add your characteristic modifier, and then, oh yeah, this is one of, sorry, I'm looking for the character sheet to show you, but I remember that they don't have an easily accessible character sheet in the back, because it's part of the shitty, well, not a shitty layout. The layout's actually not bad, but there are a couple design decisions that they made in terms of the layout that drive me bonkers. But anyway, they all are called characteristics. This is what your character sheet will look like when you're making a character. Your skills are here, so you'll take your skill rating, add that to your attribute modifier or characteristic modifier, and you are looking for, I believe it's a 10, or let me grab the sheet. I'm sorry, I actually haven't run this for about 2 weeks now, and I've been looking at other games, so unfortunately it wasn't as fresh in my mind as some of the other games are that I review, so forgive me for having to do my research beforehand, or research while I'm recording this. Yeah, the difficulty is, gosh, I cannot find it here. Oh, here we go, I'm sorry. Average is 8, so it's not 10. You're looking for it to roll a 10 or higher. I'm sorry, 8 or higher. There's also a function or sort of a rules quirk called advantage. Well, it's called boons and banes. And a boon is if there is some situational modifier that would be of great assistance, you get to roll an extra d6, and then you just pick the 2 highest rolling ones. So it's very much like if you're familiar with the 7C or 5 Rings games where you're rolling and keeping. So you're rolling 3 dice and keeping 2. Or like sort of like Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition where you're rolling 2, keeping the highest. Or like Call of Cthulhu 7th edition where you're rolling 2 10-sided dice, picking the highest of those 2, and then rolling 1 more 10-sided dice, and that's what your result is. There's also a Bane where you're rolling 3d6 and taking the 2 lowest as your result, and that's again from situational modifiers that are bad. The advice they give on when to use boons and banes and when to use just flat modifiers is a little muddled, but you really can get the hang of it pretty easily. And granting a boon seems to have an enormous effect on the dice roll, so it's an easy way to get around the fact that you're really not getting huge modifiers. One of the things I've noticed in the game is that you're not starting with a skill level higher than, I believe, 4, which means that at the very, very most skilled, you are going to be playing a character who has a skill level of 4, and attributes generally don't give you more than about 2 to your modifier. So the most extreme, most skilled people are going to succeed on most average tasks. But for most of your other skills, the other things that you're decent at, you're going to have a 1 or maybe a 0 in your. You'll still be trained in it, but you'll have a 0, and your attribute modifier or characteristic modifier might be a 1. What that means is that it can feel a bit not swingy, but it can be a little unpredictable at times. Your characters certainly don't feel overly competent in areas where they're not particularly skilled. So there is a little bit of swinginess, or kind of McHale's Navy-ish to your characters doing certain things in that. It's also, that's exacerbated by the fact that if you don't have training in a skill, so you don't even have a 0 in it, and you make a roll, you subtract 3 from your total, which means effectively an average task becomes an 11 or higher that you're adding nothing to, which means you need to roll 11 or 12 on 2d6. Which is pretty much impossible. I'm not sure what the percentages are in it, but it means that you're trying something that you're not skilled at, you are almost guaranteed to fail at it. And that's a design decision in the game, and from what I understand, it's something that's been around for a long time, but it means that your characters certainly aren't the omnicompetent characters that you would see in other role-playing games or other science fiction role-playing games, like, say, Fantasy Flight games and Star Wars. We used to have a running joke that Leia can drive a speeder bike. That we never saw Leia have any kind of training or display any kind of competence in flying around a speeder bike, but when she needed to in Return of the Jedi, she was pretty good at it. And that system supports that kind of play. This is not the case. If Leia drove a speeder bike in this, she would have crashed within seconds in all likelihood, especially given the difficulty of what that task would be. So that is the task resolution system, is always 2d6. Anything you're doing is going to involve just those d6. The game does not make use of any other dice. You only ever use d6s in it. So it's got a bit of an old school feel. It also means you're not lugging around a mitt full of dice and using a bunch of different kinds. So what do you play in it? This is one of the things where Traveller, I had heard for a long time, was one of the major selling points of the game. And I never really embraced it until this edition, because the Traveller of the New Era, you do what's called a life path system in that, and for most editions, if not all editions. I think the only edition of Traveller where you don't do a life path system, where you're creating your character starting from childhood up through their adult, early education, their young adult experiences, their career and whatnot, up to the point where they're joining the game. The only version where you don't do that, I believe, is the GURPS Traveller, because GURPS is just it's a point generation system. This edition is like those other editions, where what you are doing is you're kind of following your character along through their life. And what you cannot do, and we've learned, I actually have a video on the channel where myself and one of my players did the foolish thing and tried to decide who this character was going to be before we started rolling. If you try and do that with the life path system, unless you're dungeon master, or I guess whatever it is, whatever it's called, gamekeeper, referee, I don't know, whatever. In this game, the DM allows you to just pick your results. Then you're not going to end up with a character that you intended to play, because it's just dice. There's tons of dice rolls, and it just will not work out that way. If you approach the game, though, with the idea of a rough idea of where you want to end up, but being free to go with where the game takes you, you have for one, you end up with characters when you start the game that are very interesting, that you've carried, or you've gone through their entire lives with them. So there's a lot of investment you have in those characters as you go through. But also they feel very real. They have successes and triumphs, and they have setbacks and suffer losses. And that's, to be honest, I mean, that's what life is like. I think that as an older gamer now than what I was when I was younger, I have a better appreciation for the path that your characters go through from the point in the course of creating them. One of the most interesting things about it too is that the game encourages you to name your character first, so you know who this person is, and I love that. I'm actually going to be like any other random generation system that I use from now on. Like Conan has a great random generation system. I'm having the players name the characters first, because when you know that character's name and you're seeing all these things happen to that named character rather than some unnamed, as yet crystallized character, it is way more interesting, and you become way more invested in the character. But anyway, what you do in the game is you start off by rolling your characteristics, and those are all randomly. And I don't think I think they might give you a point generation version, but we rolled ours because we wanted to go random. Your characteristics in the game are strength, dexterity, and endurance for physical characteristics, and intellect, education, and social standing as your mental characteristics. I think most of those will make sense. The only ones that maybe are worth explaining is that social standing is sort of your place in society. It defaults as your social status, like your charisma stat in a lot of circumstances. Your education, your intellect differ in the sense that education is how much learning you got, and intellect is just your raw capabilities. And each of the characteristics not only come into play in terms of when you're doing task resolution in the game itself, they also come up in the course of play. So what you do is you first start doing you pick your backgrounds, which sort of reflects your childhood or early life development. And then what you start doing is you make decisions as to what you want to do next. So you start off with a character at 18. You decide whether you want to go to school. Is your character going to try and get into university or to a college or to enlist in the military? Or is that person going to try and get directly into a career? You make a roll. Everything, every step in your character creation is determined by a role that is modified by one or sometimes several of your characteristics. So a character who is, say, trying to get into university, if you want your character to get into university, then what you do is you roll against your education. So, or not against, but you make a roll, and you need to roll 7 or higher, and you add your education modifier. So if your character happens to do quite well and become educated, they're more likely to get into university. But you still have to also make a separate roll to see if you graduate. So we've actually had, some characters who have flunked out. And then what we do is take a moment to try and talk about what happened during that time and what we thought has happened, and that provides a ton of fun story stuff. So you're really helping to learn and bake in some backstory that you can draw on in the campaign as you go through. There are other things you get. Every step you take, there are certain benefits that you will get or certain drawbacks that you will incur. And those benefits can include things like an enemy or a contact or a rival, or you might get shares in a ship, or you might get some new piece of gear that you couldn't otherwise afford, or you might get a new extra role on a benefits table. And we'll talk about that in a moment, but it's really great because it means that it is an exciting, dynamic, dice-driven character generation, not just from generating the stats, but as you go through. Each career you go into, you have, this is what a career sheet will look like. You will go in, you'll pick a specialty, and you will randomly generate what benefit you got from that period, and you can pick from different columns. So let's say you're getting into, I'll go to an easier one here, say Army. So you've been enrolled in the Army, either because you were drafted in or because you decided to join, you were a volunteer. You would pick one of the different service branches. You would become either support, infantry, or cavalry. Support is an engineer, cook, or some other role behind the front lines. Infantry is one of the poor, bloody infantry on the ground. And cavalry is one of the crew of a gunship or tank. So you pick one of those things, and then every time you do a pass through this, which represents 4 years of your character's life, you would make a roll on either the personal development column, the service skill column, or or your specialty column. So let's say we're playing a guy who got into the infantry, or a girl. You could pick personal development, service skills, or infantry and roll on that. When you first get into a career, you get all of the skills that are the service skills. So there are certain basic things everyone will draw out of their experience in that career, at least from an initial pass through the career. But what you specialize in, or the special sort of emphasis that you get, comes from a random generation. There is a system of ranks and bonuses. So as you gain recognition in the different careers, you can gain more and more benefits that come with those ranks. When you finish your time in the career, either because you're going to join the game or because you left the career either by choice or otherwise, you will roll on mustering out benefits. You'll gain some benefits and figure out what sort of stuff you got from that career. It could be money, it could be gear, it could be allies, it could be shares in a ship, it could be part of a ship that you own. There are also mishaps. What happens for each 4 years is you make a roll to see if you survive in that career. And just because you qualify, you also have to stay in that. And they are very often, maybe always, I really haven't looked, but very often they seem to be different skills, completely or different attributes that apply. So for instance, in Army, to join the Army, to qualify, you need to make an endurance roll of 5 or higher. However, to survive in the infantry, you need to roll strength of 6 or higher. And then if you want to advance, where you're going up in your ranks, you need to make a advancement roll. And for infantry, it's education of 6 or higher. So this game doesn't really, if you're a one-trick pony where you're really awesome with one stat, but everything else is dump stats, it's going to bite you in the ass at some point. And then it just makes for so what you basically do when you're making a character is you go through these 4-year chunks as you're going through these different careers and see, what has happened, how the winds of fortune and time have affected your characters. At the end of the character generation, you'll make a decision as to when your character is going to muster out and join the game. And then depending on the character's age, you may have to make some aging rolls, which will reflect the effect of time and and the passage of time and the sort of the weight of years on your character. So their physical characteristics and even possibly their mental characteristics might deteriorate depending on how long you've stayed in the career. The upside to staying in a career for that long, though, is that obviously you get more opportunities to get more skills. So that's how you create a character. And then at the end of the character creation, when all members of the group are done, what you do is you pick a skill package. So you sort of pick what the campaign is going to be about, or what at least the group of characters are about. And then each character takes a turn to pick one of the skills that's available in the skill package. And these are the skill packages that are listed in the core book. And they include things like diplomat or explorer or mercenary. And to give you an idea of what I mean by the skills or what's available in them, let's say you're going to do just the default traveler skill package, which is just, they describe it as, it's an all-around skill package, good for a campaign where travelers are trading one week and blowing things up the next. So the skills in that one include pilot, deception, electronics, gunner, gun combat, persuade, stealth, and medic. And then what you'll do is each character who's playing in the campaign will take a turn to pick one of those skills. And then you keep doing that in a round until all of them have been picked. What that does is it gives you a little bit of an opportunity to make sure that, well, I mean, the main purpose is so that if your campaign is about that thing, you're guaranteed to have people who are at least halfway competent to doing those things. So if you're playing a mercenary campaign, you're going to have a certainty that at least somebody's got leadership, at least somebody got medic, at least somebody's got gun combat, and that kind of stuff. So it's a way of sort of dealing with the potential vagaries that come from that type of character creation system. I've only had 3 characters go through it, or 3 players play through that, but all 3 of them had a blast playing the characters. Even the one who had one character in mind when they started making the character, but ended up with this very different character. Even he said he thoroughly enjoyed it, and he loved his character and didn't want to try and change it. That's consistent with the online sort of response that I've seen to travel. That's the reason people seem to really enjoy that game. And it is really, it's unlike any other game. The closest I have seen in another game that I am familiar with is Modiphius's Conan game, where you have this very similar kind of thing. But even that, where you randomly generate the character for each passage of their life or each stage of their life, but even that game doesn't have the kind of cool bringing the group together thing at the end where there's the skill package. The Iron Kingdoms role-playing game has something like that, but it's not nearly as comprehensive as what this is. So I really like that aspect of it. And the thing I also like about that skill package system is that it isn't dependent on how big your group is. I happen to play in our Pirates of Drinax campaign, we have 2 player characters. And what that means is that we just took turns going back and forth, so they got, each of the characters got about 3 or 4 extra skill points. If we had more players, those skill points would have been spread around a little more, but it doesn't matter. Like the goal of making sure some player character has those skills that will be needed in that type of campaign is satisfied. So that's a very clever way of dealing with it. So what do you do in the campaign? I think I've kind of covered that as well too, but maybe I'll just, before I dive into the book itself and go through front to back to show you what's in here, I'll just show you the trade sheet here. So this is a chart that I've found a great deal of use for in a couple of months that we've been playing, and it is proving difficult to find because I'm looking for it and I'm lying. Here we go. So this is the trade chart here. You can see it's 2 pages set horizontally in here, and then what it includes is basically what you're doing is you're rolling 2d6. One becomes the tens digit, one becomes the ones digit, and that tells you what kind of trade good happens to be available. And then it tells you where the trade good is available, how many tons would be available for it, the price per ton. They don't make it clear in the game that the base price is per ton, but I have subsequently found online and my buddy at the gaming store's help that that's how you calculate it. There are purchase modifiers to your dice pool for, certain things are easier to buy in certain circumstances, like buying common ore is a lot easier if you're at an asteroid. Sale, so when you're trying to offload the stuff, what the modifiers would be. And then examples of what those things are. So common ore can include any ore bearing common metals. So it could be copper or tin or aluminum or whatever. And the range of trade goods, run the gamut from common raw materials like metal, plastics, chemicals, or common manufactured goods like household appliances, all the way down to addictive drugs or combat drugs, or weapons of mass destruction. I mentioned weapons of mass destruction because in our campaign, because I knew that Pirates of Dreamnauts was going to be about trade and travel and piracy and whatnot, I wanted to jump in with both feet by allowing my characters to have a hold full of stuff. So we randomly generated some stuff to fill up their cargo hold when we first started playing the game. Our first roll, I believe, was for weapons of mass destruction. So the players, our campaign is set up such that the players are cruising around with a hold full of nuclear weapons, which are extremely valuable. Like they're gonna, when they finally actually offload those things, they're gonna be extremely rich. But the trouble is that, and this is something we found in the course of just playing the game as it's written, not trying to force a story or anything like that. What we found is that because of the way the game affects dice modifiers, in particular, the law level of a settlement or a community or a system will provide a dice modifier equal to the difference between what the current law level is and at what level those things become illegal. So for instance, if you're trying to offload, let's say, a heavy machine gun or a heavy laser gun or something like that, something like a clearly military weapon, if the law level outlaws anything larger than a handgun, well, you're probably going to have a bit of a dice modifier there, because the difference between when the military grade machine guns become illegal and when handguns become illegal, there's not a huge gap there. For weapons of mass destructions, they are illegal everywhere. No private person anywhere in any civilization that has any semblance of law allows private individuals to hold nuclear weapons. So what became the case is that my players have this incredibly valuable piece of cargo, but they have to find like the scummiest of scummy places to try and offload this thing, or else they risk the chance of having a shitty dice result, which will bring the attention of the, if they're lucky, the attention of the local law enforcement, and if they're unlucky, rivals who want to take that shit from them, who will attack them in port or try and attack them while they're in transit to some new place. Now, that's just one example, and it's a pretty extreme one, I guess, but that's the kind of fun that you have with this, trade system. What you're doing in it is that going and seeing what's available and seeing how much time passes between those things is very, very cool. You also have plenty of time to get involved in other things. Like we've had one adventure, we're having a second one now that are basically going to be run in the time while the crew's sort of social guy, the guy who does he's the fixer, I guess, on board, he's doing all the trading stuff. So there's plenty of time for you to have other traditional role-playing adventures and whatnot while this trade system is going on. Or you can just ignore it. I mean, like if you want to focus more on the trade and get into new systems and whatnot, you can just do that. The game as written allows you to roll random encounters every time you jump into a new system, every time you check in to a new either a high port like a space station or a low port if you go down to the surface. And that's awesome. So like as they travel around, there's an incentive for why they're traveling, because they've got bills to pay and they need to offload this stuff and get some new cargo or passengers or mail or whatever and transport it to some other place, or maybe pick up odd jobs along the way. And because they got bills to pay, and it proves to be a really effective incentive and something that players really embrace. Like, I mean, the more so than any other game that I've run, I have found my players absorbed in the minutia of their ship, which is fascinating because normally we tend to play much more cinematic and loosey-goosey kind of systems, you know, where we're not paying attention to like how many arrows people have or what their encumbrance is or whatever. But this game, you have to track that stuff, but there's a huge benefit in terms of immersion in the game, for one, and I think payoff as well too for the players, because they're actually care, and like when they're negotiating a price with someone, that matters because they, you know, God, if I can squeeze out a little bit extra from this sale of our, you know, basic electronics that we picked up, then maybe I can, on top of paying my bills and buying new cargo, I can afford that awesome new laser gun I really want to get, or new armor, or whatever, or new upgrade for the ship, you know, or whatever. So it's very, very cool. And I love that there's also a shared resource in the game, in the sense of your ship, because your players all care about it. And this game does a better job of supporting that kind of investment in a mechanical way than, say, what Star Wars does. Star Wars, it has a lot of, the Fantasy Flight Star Wars game has some great ways of customizing your ship and whatnot too, but the economics of it just don't make fucking sense. Like the game does not, it sort of falls down there. This does not. You can just let the game, the system has been played out enough and is durable enough, you can just let it do its thing. And that's, as a DM, is really exciting. Because I don't have to worry about them getting too rich. Like, for instance, in our campaign, my players now have a second ship that they got. They managed to trick some pirates and they stole a ship. And our campaign is just letting the dice fall where they may. And it just so happened that the characters rolled really well and managed to bamboozle these pirates and steal their ship. So my characters have this sudden huge influx of money, or they will as soon as they find a way to sell it, because that thing has to be sold as well. But in the interim, they're paying for birthing fees for it. They've got to pay for repairs to that thing, and they got to find a buyer for it. So like it has, I don't know, like it's really cool the way the game sort of propels the story forward on its own. We're playing this as sort of a hybrid thing where there's like adventures going on at the same time there is this trade stuff. But honestly, I could just let them do their trade thing for a very long time, and they wouldn't care. You know, my players would be fully invested in that. So that's what you do. Now, there's nothing to prevent you from running a more traditional style role-playing game. If you want to ignore all the trade rules and just have, you know, assume that they're making enough money to keep their ship airborne and paying for the mortgage, you can do that. But I think that you'd be selling yourself short, and your players short, from a really fun opportunity to be immersed in the game. Because it really is a very well constructed set of rules that all interact really, really well. It's also interesting that it doesn't, you know, there's not one character. As much as you do get, you know, those skill set, or that skill set from the skill, or you get skills from the skill set to make sure they're okay at what they're doing. That doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to have all the skills that are necessary, particularly if you're having, you know, characters are always going to be bad at some things, which means they're going to need the help of either other PCs or NPCs, which is cool because in a very kind of old school kind of way. The game does not make your characters feel like heroes. There's no action point mechanic or any kind of way to, apart from the boon and bane, there's no other way to modify dice rolls. Players do not have a resource that allows them to control the vagaries of the dice rolls. And as I said, they're certainly not superheroes. Like they're not omnicompetent characters. They definitely have shortcomings, and things that they have shortcomings in, they will be awful at, which is realistic. I mean, you know, would that I was to try and set a bone, I'd make a fucking terrible job of it, right? Or whatever else. If I was to try and do work on my engine, it would not go well for me and would likely void my warranty and a bunch of other bad things. So it makes sense that you just have to embrace the wider world and find people to help you with that, with the shortcomings that you have. In our game, we've got an NPC who does all the wheelings and dealings, because both of our PCs are not very good at that stuff. So that's what you do. Let's talk about what's in the book then. So some of the things I should say also, as I go through the book, I'll sort of walk back some of the things I've said. When in the game that I'm running, and the game I'm enjoying so much, we are making use of not only the core book and the Pirates of Drinax campaign, we're also using the High Guard supplement, which is the Starship book. It's for building starships and space stations and shuttles and stuff like that. The Central Supply Catalog, which is this awesome book of gear, and the Vehicle Handbook, which is rules for building and examples of sample vehicles from the Traveler universe. The High Guard also has sample ships in it as well too, so it expands greatly on what's in the core book. I only mention that because there are not one of the complaints I've seen about this edition of Traveler, and again, I don't really have familiarity with earlier editions, but this edition does not have vehicle creation or starship creation in the core rulebook. I'm not going to defend or critique that decision. It's a decision they made, so it's not in there. So this review is about the core rulebook, and that does seem to be one. It's one thing you need to be aware of when you're getting this. I think almost any other sci-fi role-playing game does have. Well, I shouldn't say that. Any non-proprietary or any non-licensed game doesn't have or has starship generation rules in it or ship generation rules in it. This does not. I actually don't think the Star Wars Fantasy Flight game I know doesn't have those rules in it, and I don't think that Star Trek Adventures does either. It's got rules for customizing your ship, but it doesn't have rules for creating the template ship that you're going to be using as your shared ship. So I'm not sure that's a fair criticism of this. It's not in an apples to apples comparison to other sci-fi games on the market. I'm not sure it's really a huge negative for this. But anyway, so first thing you get here is a bit of an introduction about some of the concepts of the game, how you're rolling dice, what you're doing in the game, and then it gives you further reading ideas for other books that are coming out. One of the things that is not out yet at the time of the recording that I am very much looking forward to is something called the Traveler Companion. That is the basically big book of optional rules. So if you want to use this set of rules to run a game other than something set in the Third Imperium, that's what that game is going to give you, or that rulebook will give you. But the other things that are listed in here, Tour of the Imperium, High Guard, Central Supply Catalog, and Vehicle Handbook, those things are all pretty much keyed to this setting. So you really wouldn't be able to pick it up and run Star Wars with this, say, or like Battlestar Galactica with this. You could do it, but it would take a lot more work than just filing the serial numbers off of certain things and using it in a different way. So it talks about dice conventions in here. It introduces you to the idea of tech levels, and what tech levels are is a shorthand way of expressing how the local culture or how technologically advanced the local culture is. That runs from TL0, where there's no technology, this is like early Stone Age, through to say TL5, which is early industrial, where there's widespread electrification, telecommunications, and internal combustion, all the way up to TL15, which is high stellar, where there are black globe generators suggesting a new direction for defensive technologies. Their development of synthetic anegathic means that human lifespan is vastly increased, and jump 6 travels. You can jump 6 parsecs with it. One thing I'll say about the setting is, one of the reasons I was reluctant to run it for a long time is that it feels like 70s and 80s sci-fi. There is not a huge amount, anything from like cyberpunk or transhumanist writing or post-transhumanist writing. I'm not going to get into a lot of like the conventions of sci-fi because I'm just not familiar enough with them. But I've read enough sci-fi to know the distinctions between transhumanist writing and cyberpunk writing. This setting predates that, and it hasn't really updated to embrace those elements. And to be honest, I'm okay with it. When I first read the game, I thought, ugh, this is going to feel so dated. It's going to feel like the way that like Buck Rogers would feel, where it feels very much an element of its time or an artifact of its time. And it doesn't at all. In actual play, I don't find that to be the case at all. There is cyberpunk there is cyber technology in this. There is the possibility of doing sort of what you would recognize as a transhumanist thing where minds are being exchanged, but it's not a signature element of the campaign. The game's not really about that. So if you are looking for a sci-fi game that does embrace those more heavily, you're probably not going to find the game you want in this core rulebook, at least. But anyway, so the tech levels, the reason I was reminded of that is because the tech levels follow that 70s, 80s sci-fi assumption. Like, you know, this assumes that it's not until the very highest tech level that human lifespan is vastly increased. You know, one of the recent television TV shows released by Netflix at the time of recording is Altered Carbon, where it's not. I mean, this is that I would say is a very low, you know, tech level as far as high sci-fi tech goes in Traveler, in terms of weaponry, vehicles, cyber technology, and stuff like that. But it effectively assumes immortality for the wealthiest. So there's a bit of incongruity with certain assumptions of certain kinds of sci-fi and this setting. But anyway, that's what the setting, and it gives you an idea of what the setting is about. And you go through character creation, you know, your various career paths here. And it's pretty much, the career paths are almost anything you could think of, from a, you know, very backwards, kind of backwoods, you know, undeveloped colony, all the way up to a very hyper advanced setting. There's some great art that goes throughout the book as well too, all in full color, which I love. Gives you the very outlines of the rules for playing non-humans. There really, to be honest, isn't enough to do that. There's the Aslan there. That's the lion men I mentioned. And there's an example of the Vargur. You get the glare off. I'm just going to get my damn camera to focus. There he is. Rawr! There's a Vargur. There he is. An Aslan. So you do have the mechanics, I guess, to make them, but because of the way the career path works, it's not going to fit perfectly for how Aslan society or Vargur society works. But you know, if you don't care about that, you can absolutely play those characters in here. You've got those rules. And it gives you the basics of the dice mechanics. One neat thing I mentioned, I forgot to mention as well too, is that each skill task or each skill challenge comes with a set time frame for how long it takes you to do stuff. One of the neat ways that you get around sort of punishing dice mechanics in this is you can just take more time and you'll get a benefit. I think it's +2 for each. Yeah, up or down by 1, and you get a +2 to your roll. So it's not huge, but it's one way to, you know, to get around that problem. And it also means that it gives a way for characters, you know, sometimes there's problems that will come up. If a character is not, you know, it's someone who wants to try and break through a lock, let's say, like on the outside of a starship, and they realize, shit, this is really tough. I'm going to need some time in order to go through this. That might give other characters something to do while they occupy the attention of the guards, to give that person extra time to try and, you know, get through that lock. That's just one example, but I mean, that's one of the ways where drama and story can happen by virtue of the mechanics in the game. It then gives you a breakdown of how different skills are used. It's interesting because each skill, there's not necessarily one characteristic that each skill is linked to. So depending on what you're trying to do with your certain skill, it might require a different character, or might obtain a different characteristic bonus or penalty. An example of that would be for recon. You know, trying to work out the routines of a trio of guards would be an intellect check, whereas spotting a sniper, that's a shitty example. I picked the one that was not. Here we go. How about gunner? So if you're a gunner on a starship, if you are operating a turret, that's going to use your dexterity. It'll be your raw reflexes to modify that roll. But if you are doing artillery, where you're firing from orbit down onto the planet, your modifier will be intellect, because you're trying to calculate the trajectory and the timing and all the other crap. So it's interesting that there's not just one way to use any of the given skills. Then it gets into combat. There's a very brief section on combat. Combat is pretty. I haven't had enough of it in the game to really judge one way or the other. But combat can be pretty deadly, and I'll tell you why. It's because you don't have hit points in the game, and you don't have like a damage track the way you do in a lot of role-playing games, like Shadowrun or Art Magica, Savage Worlds to a degree, because you get your wound level. In this, instead, what you do is you take damage to your characteristics. So you start with your endurance, and then it spills over into either the strength or the dexterity. So it's interesting. That I think is a really neat way, because you do have a death spiral, but it's linked directly to your attributes, and it doesn't penalize your mental attributes, which is neat. However, as I said, the game is it can be pretty lethal. Characters get messed up pretty quickly, especially against. Well, I should say I've only had one real combat encounter, and it involved effectively kind of like a giant dog type thing, and it royally messed up one of my players. So that was only one example, but I liked that. I like the way the damage system works, because I think it reinforces in a story way what your character is experiencing, what mechanically they're experiencing. It then gives you other examples of environmental dangers like disease or fatigue or radiation. Then it gives you launches into some random encounters. Random encounters is a big part of this game. Again, like it's sort of assumed that you're going to play it in a bit of a sandboxy kind of way, where it's an open world that your characters are free to make their own decisions as to where they're going and what they want to do, and what they encounter along the way is dictated by sort of random chance, and then the way the characters respond to those things, either the threats they encounter or the opportunities they encounter, that's sort of what drives the story. So as I say, here's some lists of some random encounters, starport encounters, rural encounters, random missions, random patrons, urban encounters, and then you get into equipment, and there is not a huge section on equipment, but it does cover enough of the basics. You got some armor, some cybernetic augmentations, communications. There's some cool like faux advertisements in here as well too for different things. I thought was pretty cool and flavorful. It reminds me of old Shadowrun products where they used to have they were actually presented as a catalog that you would be looking through in that universe. So it's not as the problem with those catalogs was that the amount of crunch, like the amount of game information, was minimal, and the amount of fluff was huge. So the use of page space was not maybe, or of the page count was not the greatest. This is a much better balance, where there's a couple of these neat little things, like an advertisement for or from Biomedical about your cognitive augmentation to increase your intellect, a better body for today and tomorrow, or the integrated connect, which is physical and characteristic augmentation. Each of the equipment that you have in the section here, also it gives you the tech level for it, so you can know whether what the likelihood of you being able to buy it at any given starport or a destination that you're in, whether you're going to be able to obtain that or how hard it would be to obtain that. Like for instance, if you're at a planet where the predominant tech level is a 10, finding a tech level 15 piece of equipment is going to be pretty fucking tricky, because it's not impossible, because it just imposes a dice penalty on your roll to try and locate a vendor who might have that. But it means it's less likely for that to happen. And that's another thing that I really love about it, is that it incentivizes the characters moving around as well too, because not only do you have to have the money to buy something, you're trying to make the money to buy that thing, you also want to find a vendor who has it for sale, which gives it a very dynamic feel to it. Like if you find it at a starport, say you don't have the money to buy it because their asking price is too high, which again is dictated by some rolls that you make. If you're not able to afford it, then you can say, shit, well, I'm going to go and do some jobs, and then like a month or two later, you make your way back, and you've got the money now. It isn't a guarantee that it's still there. And I love that, because it again gives it that very lived-in feel. And I don't know. So anyway, that's another feature, I think, of the game, not necessarily a bug. Then we get into, let's see here, medical and care supplies. What else is here? Sensors, melee weapons. This is what, you know, interstellar traveler wouldn't want to carry their club or their cutlass around. Those would, of course, be useful for not piercing the hull of your ship when you're using, say, your plasma rifles. Here's the ray guns we want to see in the game. There's not like I said, there's not a huge amount of selections, but there's about, for each of the sort of categories of the gear, there's about between 15 and 20 selections for each of these, which is a lot. There's also the Central Supply Catalog provides a huge amount more, like just a massive array of very cool stuff and ways to customize gear and stuff like that. But this is a good starting point. You know, sci-fi stories incorporate a shit ton of things, you know, gear and different worlds and different, you know, vehicles and starships and stuff like that. So it's a lot of stuff to cover in one game. And then there are some weapon options in here as well. So if you want to add a scope or like a suppressor or something like that to your weapon, or make it an intelligent weapon, you can do that. Then it transitions into vehicles, gives you the rules for vehicles. And I really like the rules for vehicles and starships are very abstracted. This isn't a matter of sitting down and playing a miniature game and, you know, to resolve any kind of violent conflict between a vehicle and another vehicle, or a starship and another starship. I contrast this, which made a conscious decision in this edition to move away from the sort of like map-driven tabletop play with how you do starships in Starfinder, say. Starfinder came out after this game, but it's a contemporary game. And this feels a lot looser, and there are still clear rules for how you're gaming out combat or conflict between vehicle and vehicle, or ship and ship, but it's a lot less nitty gritty and a lot less, you know, it's less gamey. It feels more narrative, I think, than what it would be if I was having to use a map for it. Then it gives you some examples of vehicles and some equipment you can do to customize them. There's not a huge amount of variety in the vehicles that are included. And in fact, that's kind of it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you got 7 vehicles that are sort of samples for that. Then it gets into spacecraft operations, which gives some great ideas, or great insight, I should say, into things like, you know, what happens when you don't pay your mortgage with a ship? What happens when you don't pay for the, you know, the upkeep that you need to pay for every month for your ship? What happens when a jump goes wrong? Random space encounters, that kind of stuff. Gives you insight into travel times between, you know, when you jump into system and when you are traveling to the spaceport and so forth. Then it gets into the rules for space combat. Now, while space combat is a more narrative exercise, you shouldn't take from that it is a boring or not a intricate, like there's a good set of fairly complex rules that a more gamist-minded player can really lock onto. So there is certainly enough game there to make it an interesting exercise. It's not just a matter of, you know, rolling 1 or 2 dice and then sort of like hand waving the combat. You can run very exciting encounters with that. And I think, yeah, that's, there are rules in high guard for more involved combat, like say the type that involves fleet scale ships, or, you know, fleets or squadrons of dogfights of fighters. But that's not in this book. So it's just the basics of say like ship to ship, you know, or maybe 2 ships in 1 ship combat. And then it gives you some examples of some common spacecraft. There's about, I believe, about 10 in here. And one of the things that I absolutely love about this rule book and this game is every ship that they give in here, not only give a you know, little illustration of what the ship looks like, and you got your stats that are obviously important there, you have a ship layout for every single ship. And for long-time Traveler players, that may be a default assumption. Like looking through the materials that I've purchased for the older version of Mongoose Traveler, that seems to be what has always been the case. But for someone who is coming at this from other sci-fi games, this is so great. Like, I love that I can draw, plunk down the map on my, because I normally play on Roll20, I can take it from the PDF, put it into as an image on my screen, and we can specifically show where everyone is, when we're going through, if they're exploring a ship that they're stealing. Like I said, in my recent, in our campaign, my players recently stole a ship, and we were able to do that infiltration, in a very, very easy way, because we all had the core rule books. We could refer to the map of that type of ship and describe, and follow through where they're going. It also gave them, for one of the characters has a lot of familiarity with these kinds of ships, so being able to sort of, direct the player to the map and say, this is what your character knows, this kind of thing is normally laid out like. It's just awesome. And every single one of the ships in the book and in Highguard has those kind of, those floor plans for the ship, and I love that. So as I said, there actually may be more than 10. Maybe there's more ships in here. I'm not going to count them off, but there's enough to get you started. Like, there aren't rules for creating your own. There aren't rules for modifying the ships. So if you don't have Highguard, you're going to have to sort of, as the DM, you have to sort of eyeball what the cost would be for changes or things like that. Then it gives you rules for Psionics, and Psionics is a bit of a it's not a core element of the game. You could easily play the game without ever incorporating Psionics. And I don't have any psychic character. I have one psychic character who is in my campaign, but he has not been played yet. So I really can't speak to how powerful they feel in gameplay, how disruptive they feel otherwise. But the sense I get is that it's very low key. Like, because the way that you create a psychic character is by basically spending time in a career that is Psion. So what that means is that if you're spending time developing your psychic abilities, you are not spending time learning the other skills and getting the other experiences that other characters are. So psychics will either be, very moderately powered if you're doing a character who is doing a little bit of psychic stuff and then also having some other life experiences, or they're going to be one-trick ponies where they're very good at their psychic abilities, but they pretty much are not great at other abilities. So there's some interesting broad powers you get in here as well. Telekinesis, awareness, which is like clairvoyance kind of, teleportation. What else is in here? Telepathy, and yeah, and that's it. So, and there's also an ability. Awareness actually is not clairvoyance. Clairvoyance is a separate ability. Awareness is like physical enhancements. So there's a good representation of sort of the signature sci-fi psychic stuff that you would see, and it's expanded greatly in an older version, or a book put up for the older version called Scion. Gives you a shit ton more options for playing, like, like if you're part of a backward society where the psychics are all incorporated into some kind of warrior cult, like the magic Knights Templar kind of stuff, then you can create characters that are like that. But in a core rulebook, that's not the assumption. That's not what you're necessarily capable of. Then it gets into the section on trade, where it gives you all the rules for conducting trade. And one of the things that I have found with that is, you as a DM do not need to intervene. Like, there are times when I'm running other games where, in any game, to be clear, and this game is the same too, they encourage you to be a fan of the players. They want you to want to see them succeed. And in some games, they encourage you to sort of help nudge, put your finger on the scale to help players with that. This game, while they want the characters to succeed, for some of these elements, for like the character generation roles, for the trade stuff, it is better to not do that. Just trust that the system is going to work itself out, so that the windfalls and the catastrophic setbacks will sort of balance out, and at the end of the day, the characters will end up with sort of a parity of experiences, or an even level of experiences that will hit certain extremes because of the vagaries of the dice. And that's the way trade works. Trade can go really great or really awful. And then sometimes, like with my example of my characters or my players, whose characters have a hold full of nuclear weapons that initially seems, oh, so great, we're going to be so rich, to the realization of like, shit, how are we going to get rid of these things? And that's just phenomenal. The final section is world and universe creation, which gives you rules for randomly generating different worlds. So if, I mean, you're free to, build up the world the way you want and create a very intricate sort of sandbox for your players to fly around in, or to use some published product like, say, the Pirates of Drenax campaign or the Great Rift campaign, which is going to be coming out quite soon at the time of recording as well. These things are amazing. I'm going to do a review of the Pirates of Drenax game in a couple of months. For one, because I want my damn physical copy to come in, but also I want to really get into, in my campaign, I want to get into the actual piracy crap before we start talking about that. But that book has not only so much set material in it that you could use as a DM, where the players say they're going to go to a certain system, and you can go and look up and see what's in there. There still is a lot of opportunity to make use of these random things. And I mean, there's nothing to stop you from setting it up the way that you want. But the reason that I think the random stuff is included as the default play, and why I would encourage you as a first-time maybe traveler DM to use it, is because it's just fun as a DM. Like you don't expect the results sometimes, and that's great. Like more so, I still have plenty of opportunity to inject story and play fun NPCs and get the challenge and reward my players. But there's also an element of the unexpected that comes from that, where you just trust the system and let it, the chips fall where they may, and let the characters respond to that. That is really enjoyable and would not be there if they were following through a set script of what I had said was going to happen. So I think there's a darn good reason for why they keep including that stuff in editions of Traveler again and again and again and again. Okay, so I said that was the final system, the system generation, but I actually was fibbing. It turns out that was the penultimate section. And before I fib again, I'll make sure. Yeah, that's the penultimate one. So the final setting is the Sindal subsector, and this is the one that I had mentioned. To give you an idea of what the sector maps look like, this is the Sindal subsector. Let me get my, hold on, camera, work with me. There we go. Boom. That's what the subsector looks like. And it's fucking going out of, there we go. So your different systems in there, and you'll notice that there are a bunch of numbers and codes and stuff like that underneath there. That tells you everything you need to know about the system. You refer, oh, come on, camera, work with me. It keeps wanting to focus on my fingers. Sorry, folks. All right. Would you focus, please? Come on. I'm sorry, I really can't get this to work. There we go. So you can see that there's numbers in there. What that does is it tells you what the various tech level, the law level, the amount of population that's there, what kind of starport is there, if any, what kind of gas giant is there, if the players want to just go and scoop up some methane to be able to refill their fuel tanks. And that's what the sector map. So that is a subsector, and that's a sector. That is the sector right there. So the Sindal subsector is part of the Trojan Reaches sector, which is this wide sort of area right here. And then in this section, they give you readouts of some of the major, actually of all the major systems that are in there, and then some hints of like what patron might be found there, and what kind of missions you might go on. So there's a great amount of things that are just waiting for the players to get involved with. So that's what's in here. Now, if you've been listening along carefully, one thing that I did not mention as being in here is a glossary, and there's not. For whatever reason, they made the decision to not include a glossary in this. And I've heard that the logic behind that may have been because they're expecting that most of the sales will be in PDFs. In a PDF, you can do a Control F search, and you'll be able to find whatever it is you're looking for. I kind of call bullshit on that because in later releases, they do include glossaries. So I think that either there was a page count issue or there was a forethought. The reason I think that's a problem is because there's been lots of times where I'm flipping through this damn book trying to find the organization in terms of topics is really good, but trying to find an answer to a specific question sometimes can be a royal pain in the ass in this rule book because there's no glossary. Now I have a PDF of this as well, so I've got no real excuse to not just use that to look it up. But anyway, so that's what's in the book. So as you can see, there's an enormous amount of material in there, and it's material that really, from my perspective, it really shines once you start playing with it. When I first read the rules for it out, to be honest, was very lukewarm. I was like, all right, well, it's a pretty book. I like that there's a lot of stuff in there, but I don't get what the hype is about. And it wasn't until I sat down and we created characters with it that one spark first kind of lit, and I was like, oh my God, like, I can't wait to see what happens to these characters. And then as we started playing and using the random elements, we've been recording and streaming our Pirates of Drinax campaign, and you can see our first experience with the trade system. And all of us were coming away saying, holy shit, this is so much fun. And that's really impressive. Like, I mean, for a game that can be that much fun to just learn, that's a big achievement for them. So there's a lot more to the game. If what I've shown you here doesn't seem like it's particularly interesting, I would encourage you to, if you're curious, at least try to get in on the game, a character creation session or something like that. Who's this for? So as I said, this game, the core rulebook at least, is the assumption is you're going to be playing it in a very specific type of way, which is you're going to be playing travelers going around, probably in the Sindal subsector. You're probably going to have a ship, and you're going to be making your money by doing missions if you can get them, by transporting cargo or transporting passengers, or doing some free trading, trying to buy and sell stuff on the open market, or any combination of those things. You could there's always opportunities to fill up the ship with extra stuff. The fun, I think, that comes from is because it is an interesting and varied universe, and every system you go into is very different than the last, and you don't necessarily know what you're getting into. Then there's a lot of, and because of the random generation, there's a lot of the unexpected that can happen in that, and it can make for a very fun, emergent game, or emergent story in the course of the game. And the way that, like, old school sandbox games, the way that people talk about old school sandbox games like Keeping the Borderlands, or what's the Lost Temple, the Lost City, the one with that introduced the Yumanti. That's the way I think this game can be played. If you're interested in playing that in a science fiction universe that does not incorporate, or at least does not put the spotlight on some of the more modern sci-fi contrivances or tropes, I guess, not contrivances. That sounds more negative or pejorative than I'm intending. It's not a cyberpunk game. It is not a transhumanist game. It is a game. It's not really a game about ideas even. When we were getting ready to play Traveler, what I had said is that sci-fi, unlike fantasy, sci-fi is about us. It's always about us. It's about the human condition. That's what sci-fi is. It's cerebral, it's contemplative, and blah, blah, blah. Not sci-fi films. Sci-fi literature is about that. Traveler, I don't think, is necessarily about that. I mean, Traveler is about the sort of, frontier. It's almost like a Wild West kind of setting, in the sense that not that you're a gunfighter, but that you're a pioneer. You're trying to, make life, or make a life on the sort of outskirts of civilization, where there's all these challenges and whatnot that you're encountering. That's particular to the Sindal subsector, I should say, because Sindal subsector does not have, and the Trojan Reaches sector in general, they don't have one major power. You're not in the, under the control of the Third Imperium. You could run that type of game using this rule book, but you'd be missing, because there's no um, ship generation, no vehicle generation. You're going to be, I think, very quickly find yourself at a loss for stats for certain things, like, battleships and shit like that. So that's, I think, what you can do with the core rulebook. If that interests you, then I would strongly encourage you to give it a go. If you're interested in playing a role-playing game that will play at the table a lot like the Firefly, the underlying elements of the Firefly TV show, I think you would love this game. I think that you play very strong characters with strong characters in the sense that you've seen, the history. You're well aware of the backstory of this character because you as a player have lived through it as you created your character. It is one of the most engaging character creation systems of any role-playing game I've ever played. I really, really love as a DM. It's been fun going through it, and it's been really cool seeing how much attachment the characters get to it, and how much fun it is too. Like, I can't think of another system, including Conan, where because you're rolling successes and failures in the course of your character's character creation, it's exciting. It's, you're hoping, like, come on, get through university, don't drop out, or like, get through your next year of life in the Navy, because then you'll be eligible for promotion to captain and whatever. And that's awesome. I mean, that's a level of investment in character creation and a level of drama in character creation that I don't see in other role-playing games. So if that sounds cool to you, I think this will really speak to you as well. If, however, you want to play a more action-oriented type of sci-fi game, like, say, you wanted to play, a kind of a run-and-gun type setting where, you're routinely facing off against hordes of, more like a Star Wars type thing, this is absolutely not the game for you. I don't think the combat system seems far too lethal, and I don't think you would have a great time. That's not to say that you can't run military campaigns with this, because there's plenty of great source books that allow you to do that. I think that with the core rulebook, though, you will not have the tools you need in order to do that. So I think that that you would be disappointed if that's the kind of game you wanted to play. In addition, as I said, the game's not the mechanics. The mechanics of the game, they are not a fan of your character. There's nothing that makes your character different, as far as the mechanics are concerned, from Joe Blow on the street. You don't have more hit points. You don't have, better armor or whatever. So you don't have any other sort of safety wheels or training wheels in the game to prevent you from dropping like a fly. So playing that kind of game would definitely run count. You would have a bad time doing it. To steal an old South Park line, if you pizza wins your French fry, you're going to have a bad time. And using this game for that kind of campaign, you're going to be pizzaing when you should be French frying. So what else is that not? I don't think that it would be particularly good with the core rulebook unless you are happy to do a lot of extra work to try and use this to run another setting, like either a licensed setting. If you want to do one of your own creation, fill your boots. You could absolutely do that with this, but there are assumptions about the tech that is made in this game that would constrain that kind of creation. If you want to play a game where the characters zip around the galaxy like they do in Star Wars, where they're, a one-man ship, like an X-Wing, can get someone from one system to another quite easily, this is not the game. There's going to be some work that you'll have to do to replace the existing space rules. But, all those things said, I think that even if I would still suggest giving this game a try. I did not play Traveler for years and years and years, and this is my first involvement with it, and I just love this game. Like, I love running it, and my players seem to really enjoy playing it. And one of the reasons I think that why it's such a joy to engage with this game is because all of the interlocking kind of complex bits, they're not onerously complex. Like, this is not, if you're familiar with old, like, Starfleet battles stuff where there's, binders full of rules. That is not this game. There's a lot of stuff where you're referring to charts and stuff like that, but most often that's when you're doing trading or other things like that. And so it doesn't really disrupt the flow of play. And it's because it is a robust subsystem in the game, the players are as much invested in it as what the DM is. So I don't feel like they're sitting around waiting for the DM to look at the rule. The players, if anything, if your players are canny and real games kind of oriented people, they're going to be looking to try and find ways to benefit. Like in my campaign, my players have picked out at least a handful of other systems where they're like, we can go here and try and sell some of this crap because we'll get these kind of bonuses to our trade rolls for trying to sell there. And that's exactly what the game is intended, I think, to be played as, is for players to have fun by engaging with the rules and the setting and the fiction in that way. So yeah, so anyway, that's my thought as to who this would be, for or not. I know I had a lot of divergences or a lot of sort of diversions, I should say, in the course of this review, and I think partly it's because I just really, really enjoy this game. I really cannot say enough good things. Apart from, again, I guess, if you really want to play this for an extended period and you want to run it for a long campaign, what I would suggest is, at a minimum, picking up those extra books. To be honest, the vehicle handbook is probably the least necessary of that. Unless you're going to be incorporating a lot of vehicle combat in it, most of that shit can probably be just hand-waved. That's of the three. However, Central Supply Catalog is amazing. It's a great resource in terms of helping your characters buy cool stuff, to start their characters off with, or to start their wish list of the things they want to buy. My players have already got a planned out, the trading part of their campaign is partly to find places to trade and sell their stuff, and also partly to find places where they can buy the stuff they've got on their wish list. So this, I think, is awesome. I'll do a proper review of the Central Supply catalog at a later time, but that, I think, is quite necessary. And if you're incorporating space combat or space travel at all, this is a great resource to get. It gives you some good information on the starship creation and a huge amount of extra, of this book. More than half of it, this second half here, this is all sample ships. So they give you some very good, robust rules for creating and modifying ships, as well as some advanced technology or primitive technologies to reflect the different tech levels that the characters will encounter as they explore the galaxy. But the expanded rules for combat and for starship combat and starship modification and stuff like that is pretty key if you're going to incorporate that stuff. So if you do want to run a more extended game with Traveller, I would highly recommend picking that up as well. So anyway, that is my review of the second edition core rulebook of Traveller, published by Mongoose Publishing. As always, if you have any comments, questions, or concerns regarding this review, or if you have any questions about aspects of the game that I haven't touched on, or if you are someone more conversant with Traveller than what I am, and I fucked something up, please feel free to leave a comment to correct me, or to pose those questions, concerns, or whatever, and I will address those in a timely fashion. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening to this very long review. I hope that you have found this informative and helped you make a decision as to whether or not Traveller will be the sci-fi game for you. I'm trying to think what is the next. I actually don't know what the next review is, so I'll have to refer back to my my blog post to find out what that is. But this coming week we have actually something new coming up on Wednesday, which will be interesting. So if you have been following our regular Wednesday sessions, we got something new we're kicking off on Wednesday. That'll be interesting. And then we will be back to our regular bi-weekly Pirates of Drenax Traveller campaign in a week's time, or a week and change. So if you are interested in seeing this game in actual play, we have a series of videos posted of our actual play sessions. And you can see we're fumbling our way through the rules of how trying to figure out some things, but that might give you an idea of both character creation and what actual play for the game is like. So anyway, thank you as always. Thank you very much for listening. I greatly appreciate any comments that anyone has in relation to this review or the channel in general. And I hope you all have a terrific weekend, and I'll see you again soon.